Alright, so now it's time to look at the actual argument. So this argument has 9 total steps to it, and the general outline is that of a reductio ad absurdum. Roughly, that's just a form of argument in which you assume your opponent's view is true, then you somehow show, by further reasoning, that that assumption of your opponent's view leads to a contradiction. And if your opponent's view leads to a contradiction, well, then the opposite must be true. Okay, so how is he starting off this argument? Well, he's assuming that God exists in the understanding, right? This is something we think we've proved now, right? So even if you're the atheist, you have to grant that number one is true, right? So whether you believe in God or you're an atheist, number one is true. God exists, at least in the understanding, right? So, excuse me, even the atheist will say, yeah, sure, I understand what God means and the definition of God, so on and so forth. So I know he exists in my understanding, but he doesn't exist in reality. Okay, so one is true. Two, God might have existed in reality. Three, if something exists only in the understanding and might have existed in reality, then it might have been greater than it is. Okay, so two is really only claiming that God's a possible being. God might have existed in reality. God might have been able to jump over the line in our diagram from the white to the black area. This is a controversial claim, but I think insofar as you understand what's being said by the greatest conceivable being, it seems like the greatest conceivable being is at least possible. So we'll grant this for now. We might come back and critique it later. But seems true right off the bat. And then three is just our claim we've already determined in our discussion of existence. So really, three is just claiming that existence is a great-making property. Right? If something exists only in the understanding and might have existed in reality, then it might have been greater than it is, because existence is a great-making property. Right? So if you have something that existed only in the understanding, well, then you could say, hey, it might have been greater than it is if it also existed in reality. So 1 and 3 we've already determined are true from our prep work. 2 seems to be true once you understand Anselm's definition of God. Okay, and then the really important stuff starts to happen here, right? So in 4, Anselm is assuming the atheist's view. Assume God exists only in the understanding. So Anselm might have gotten the atheist earlier, right? And he said, haha, at least you have to admit that God exists in the understanding. But now the atheist is going to say, okay, fine, Anselm. God exists in my understanding, but that's the only place he exists. He doesn't also exist in reality. God's just sort of stuck in the realm of the understanding in our world. He never actually made it into reality in our universe. Okay, so now this is the assumption that Anselm's going to try and prove leads to a contradiction. So let's see how he tries to do that. I'm going to read through the rest of the argument, and then we'll go back and discuss some of the premises. Okay, so once we assume that God exists only in the understanding, well, then we see God might have been greater than he is. Think about why that is, given our talk about existence. 6, God is a being than which a greater is possible. That just follows from number 5. If God might have been greater than he is, well, then that means there's something possible that's greater. 7, the being than which none greater is possible is a being than which a greater is possible. That just follows from 6 when you replace the word God with Anselm's definition. And then 8, thus it is false that God exists only in the understanding, because 7 is a contradiction, so the opposite of 4 must be true. Thus we can conclude that God exists in reality as well as in the understanding, and the reductio is complete. Okay, so what's happened here? It probably looks pretty confusing at first. Let's see if we can make sense of it. Okay, so the first part is understanding 5. Right? So we have this claim. Once we assume God exists only in the understanding, well, then we see that God might have been greater than he is. If you see my little notation here, that depends on premises 2, 3, and 4. So 2, 3, and 4 all come together to prove 5. So if God might have existed in reality, so we think God's possible, but the atheist is right that God only exists in the understanding and not in reality, well, then we can think of a God or a being that's greater than God, right? We can think of a God that exists not just in the understanding, but also in reality. So in the same way we thought that the Ford Focus 3000 or unicorns or the Fountain of Youth would all be greater if they also existed in reality, the same is applying here to God, right? So that's really all that 5 is saying. So if we think God exists only in the understanding, well, then he fails to have that great making property of existence. So then God might have been greater than he is if he actually existed. So 6 follows directly from 5. God is a being than which a greater is possible. That's essentially just a different way of saying number 5. So God might have been greater than he is. That means God is a being, and there's a being that's even greater than him. Right? If he could have been greater than he is, then we can imagine a God who is greater than the one who only exists in the understanding. So 7, like I already said, just replaces the word God in number 6 with Anselm's definition of God. And so the being than which none greater is possible, in other words, God, is a being than which a greater is possible. And hopefully you see automatically that that's a contradiction, right? You're saying there's this being, there's none greater possible than this being, but there is a greater possible than this being, right? It should look strange to you immediately. Hopefully you can see that's a contradiction. A being can't have both of those properties at the same time. That's impossible. There can't be none greater, but also something greater. That doesn't make any sense. So 8 is just saying, hey, look, we found our contradiction in number 7, so our assumption at number 4 must be false. Right? So really 8 is just saying 4, but it's false. Thus, it is false that God exists only in the understanding. In other words, the atheist view leads to a contradiction, so their view must be false. And if the atheist, so in number 9, if the atheist view is false, that God exists only in the understanding, well, then we know God must exist in reality as well as in the understanding. God must exist in both places. We tried it out thinking that God only exists in the understanding, and we saw how problematic that was. So God must exist in both. Okay, so hopefully you have a pretty good feel for the argument now. We just take our prep work, take the definition of God, and then see when we combine our prep work with number 4, the atheist assumption, it leads to all sorts of problems. So we can conclude that the atheist view is false. So what are we supposed to do now, right? So first, you should try and understand this argument. If you're having a tough time with it, please email me so we can talk about it further. Do the readings for the week as well. If you read Anselm's direct quotes and then the parts in the book, that should make it easier to understand. But after you come to at least understand what the argument's saying, what are you supposed to do after that, right? Should you just conclude that Anselm's proven the existence of God? Well, that wouldn't be very intellectually responsible, right? We should see if this argument holds up to scrutiny. So one way we could do that is by questioning the reasoning of the argument. That's normally a good place to start, but I'll just let you know up front. The reasoning in this argument is solid. So what are we supposed to do instead? Well, we have to question the truth of the premises, right? So we can't question number 4. That's just an assumption. And basically 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, those all just follow once we have 1 through 4. So what we have to do now, and we'll do this in the next video, is look at premises 1, 2, and 3 and see if we can come up with an objection to any one of those. So at the end of this video, I highly suggest you just look at numbers 1 through 3 and pick one. Pick one which you think is the most likely to be false, right? And then try and think of a good counterexample to that. And yeah, so in the next video, we'll actually dive in and look at some objections people have raised throughout history to Anselm's ingenious argument. All right, thank you.